Hi, this is Kevin Wilson of the Urban Homesteading School in Powell River on the west coast of Canada. Legumes are the pea and bean family, and today's session covers hardy legumes, those we can plant before the last frost date in spring and which prefer cool weather. Now, the most well-known kind of hardy legumes are peas. 4 different kinds of peas. Shelling peas or English peas, those are the kind where you can't eat the pod, you have to shell the green peas out of the pod, but you eat them fresh. Varieties of those include green arrow for bush peas and tall telephone and alderman for tall binding peas. There's many more, especially in the UK where peas are a favourite vegetable. Snow or sugar peas are the second kind. Those are the flat ones that you see in Asian stir fries. You can eat the pods with those. Some kinds taste best before the peas develop at all, when the pods are still completely flat, but others still taste good when the peas have grown quite big inside the pods, and of course then you get more food for your square foot area that you're growing the plants in. Varieties of sugar peas or snow peas are Oregon sugar pod, dwarf grey sugar, Oregon giant. Those are all bush types. There are vining types as well. The third kind of peas are snap peas, and those are the ones with the big, thick, round, edible pods, where you eat the whole thing and they go crunch, crunch when you bite into them. The peas inside those are full size when they're ready, so you get a lot of weight of food produced per area. Varieties of snap peas include Sugar Ann, Sugar Daddy, Cascadia, those are all bush types, and Super Sugar Snap vine. The original Sugar Snap had some limitations, and the Super Sugar Snap improves on those. Those can grow up to about 8 feet high. I have had to get a ladder out in order to harvest off the top of them. And the fourth kind of peas, which aren't so often grown nowadays, but are still worth it, those are soup or drying peas. And they're not meant for eating fresh. The pods are tough. The peas are not very sweet. They're intended for drying and using in soup and stews and so on. Anywhere where you might think to use a dried bean, you can use a dried pea. You need to allow those to mature all the way to completely dry. And for us, that's pretty reliably the first week in August. They are way more reliable than dry beans for us because they dry down earlier. We often get rain starting in September, and the dried beans very often are not completely dry by then. Good varieties of soup peas include Carlin, which is the one we see most of here in the Pacific Northwest, Cappuccino, which is a heritage pea from Holland, Swedish Red, and Gold Harvest Bush. Those first 3 are all vining types that grow tall. So how do you grow peas? Well, the first thing to know is that you need to plant early. In the open, in our area, mid-March is a normal kind of time to plant peas. You can start them a little bit earlier, say in a greenhouse or in your basement in pots, and plant them out in mid-March, which will get them started sooner, but they may not make it if there's really severe weather after you plant them. You might be able to get away with planting them earlier if you have a warm microclimate, like if you're right down by the sea, or under protection, or if it's just being a really warm spring. We do get them sometimes. Now, if you plant all the peas that you want for the year at the same time, they're all going to come ripe and ready at the same time, which is fine if you want to process them. You can store them by freezing. People even can them, though I think that's a waste of peas, personally. So it's better if you plant in succession so that your fresh peas keep coming on every few weeks and you have them for a longer period. At the beginning of the season, you can space them out by every 3 weeks, and as spring goes on and we get warmer, you can plant them more closely together. One way of getting them going quickly when it's pretty cold outside, or even when it's too hot outside really, is to pre-sprout them. You can soak them overnight for about 12 hours and plant them immediately, or you can let them go through the process you would for eating sprouts, where you rinse them and put them back in a jar and rinse them and put them back in a jar every day until you see them just sprout, and then plant them. Don't let the little roots get too long because they're very fragile. The longer they are, the more fragile, more likely they are to get broken off when you plant. Peas can be transplanted, but it's a lot of work for not much gain. Direct seeding is a lot easier and usually just as reliable. If you do want to transplant, one way I've developed is to plant 5 to 7 peas in a 3 or 4 inch pot and then plant them together as a clump. Don't try and separate them out because you'll just damage the roots. But peas like to be close together. You can plant a clump like that and then plant another clump about 6 inches away, so you can have your row, but it's in a row of clumps instead of a row of spaced out single plants. Now, many people do plant a single row against a strip of netting for support, and I think this is a waste of space because peas like to grow close together. You can plant them within 1 or 2 inches of each other and they'll be perfectly happy. So spreading them out every 4 inches along a piece of netting as a single row gives you very, very little use of space. For the amount of space it takes up, you could get a lot more peas. So what I do is I plant in a band about 4 to 6 inches wide, as long as you like, as long as the bed or less. And then with peas, 1 to 2 inches apart all over the band. So I'll just take a hoe and hoe a trench about 1 inch, maybe 2 inches deep along the bed where I'm going to be planting them, and then scatter the pea seeds in the bottom of the trench. If I'm feeling particularly obsessive, I'll space them out very carefully 1 to 2 inches apart, or if I'm in a hurry, I'll just chuck them in there and they'll average out to 1 to 2 inches apart. Some of them will be really close, some of them won't be. It doesn't matter. The peas do not mind. So on one of my 3-foot beds, I can put 2 bands of peas, and then there's space for another band of something, either side or even in the middle if the peas are quick ones. I find here that I do need to cover with chicken wire to stop the birds from pulling up the seedlings. The first couple of years I was in this garden, the birds didn't bother the peas. The 3rd year, they discovered them, and I had 2 pea plants left in a 26-foot bed of peas. That was very disappointing. So chicken wire goes over them all now, and the birds, they've pretty much given up, but I'm sure if I didn't put the chicken wire on, they'd discover them again. The one thing you must remember, though, if you're putting chicken wire over the top, is to remove it before the peas get too big. They really need to be only about 2 inches high or 2 inches through the netting. If you let them get much further, you won't be able to pull the netting off without damaging them, and then you won't be able to weed the bed later on, so chaos will ensue. Now, pea vines, they really do need support. Some of the shorter bush kind, you will read that they don't, but that's not my experience. They always fall over and lay on the ground. So they don't need a lot of support. They're light plants. They're not putting a great deal of weight on it. So the traditional method in the UK is pea sticks for bush peas, which is just bits of brush with twigs sticking out, and you stick them in the ground around the peas. Peas cling onto them and climb up them, and everybody's happy. Another way of doing it is just to take some small fencing. If you've got something like one of those expanding bamboo or willow trellises, spread that out long and low and stick it in the ground. I came across the end of a garage sale one time where they were giving away the rest of the stuff for free, and they had some low green wire fencing that came in sections and folded up. And that was an excellent price because I've been using it for the last 10 years, every year, for multiple things. It's very handy. So you can probably find those kinds of things in dollar stores. They're cheap and cheerful, but they're surprisingly useful. Another way of doing the support is to have some kind of short A-frame trellis that goes over the top. You can run strings on it or not, as you like. Usually what I find with that is the peas grow up the middle of the A-frame and then start to flop outwards, and I just wrap string around the whole thing. Everything just gets wrapped in together. So once your peas have grown and they're big enough to eat, be a little cautious, because what I often find with many varieties is that the pods will grow to full size and be all puffed up and round and look lovely, and you open it up and the peas inside are still tiny. You really have to pay attention, open a few before you do the full harvest, and make sure your peas have grown. You can actually look through them at a light, like the sun, and see how big the peas are inside because the pods are kind of translucent. Now, peas like cool weather, so once we get into summer, it's hard to keep them going. You can try a partial shade location. They do like a little bit of sun, but they will take quite a bit of shade. It's best to use varieties which are resistant to diseases like anation and powdery mildew. We'll talk about that in a little while. Vine snap peas will often keep producing for months and months if they don't get powdery mildew. You can try resistant varieties to get that to happen, and there's also milk and baking soda sprays, which if you start them early enough before the powdery mildew starts, they can be preventative. Don't forget to save seeds. You will have to let them dry on the plant, which takes quite a lot longer than just getting green peas. But it's a great way to carry on varieties that you think are good and that work well for you. Very easy. They don't usually cross with anything. Peas flowers are constructed in such a way that what almost always happens is the flower pollinates itself before it completely opens. So there's no way for cross-pollination by insects to happen because it's already happened before the flower even opens. But it does occasionally happen. If you have an organic garden with lots and lots of insects, you can see some crossing. So, keep them apart by time, have them flowering at different times, or by space, as much space as you can give them. I've actually never had crossing happen that I have noticed, and I save a lot of different varieties of peas. Some very different varieties where you really would notice if they crossed. For fall planting, the critical thing about this is the timing, and I have never managed to get it absolutely spot on because, of course, it changes from year to year and you don't know what the weather is going to be like after you plant. I think it helps a lot if you try snow peas because they will give you the quickest harvest and the most likely to give you something before frost. You can try seeding in the first half of August if you're in Powell River like I am. September is definitely too late for my garden. Now you've got your lovely peas grown and you're ready to harvest them, and you've checked a few to make sure that they're at the right stage. For snow peas, you want to harvest while they're still flat before the peas swell. That's for the small podded kind. Some varieties have big pods and they are still good and even best when the peas are partly developed. What you'll need to do is just try some. Keep trying them at different stages and work out what's best. Snap peas, you want to let them get fat, but not over flat. And what you can tell that because instead of being round, the peas have a dip along one side where the pod has grown, but the string, which is still there, even though they're mostly stringless, the string doesn't expand as much as the pod does, so you get a dip along one side. And if you pick them then, they're still edible, but they're not as sweet and as juicy and as tender as they could be. So again, test them as you go along and see what's best for your garden and the varieties you're growing. And one small tip from when I was doing a market garden, my first big harvest of snap peas, I went along the row and I was dropping the peas as I harvest them into ice cream buckets on the ground. So that was about maybe a 3 or 4 foot drop, and I realized when I came to the end, I wish I'd looked earlier, that the peas pods were actually being bruised by being dropped. They had little white marks all over them, which were bruises. So that was disappointing, and I learned to have waist level buckets so that I could put the peas carefully into them instead of bruising them. And if you see snap peas with those white marks on the pods, that's what it is. It's not diseases or anything, it's just that they've been banged about a bit while they were being harvested. So peas have pests and diseases like every kind of vegetable. The pest that we see most here in Powell River is pea weevils, and they're very common in the Pacific Northwest. They're little worms that eat the pea seeds. They're mostly a problem for me with dried peas, but I do occasionally see them on green shelling peas as well. They overwinter in plant debris, so clean up your pea beds. Rotate your pea locations so that if they are lying around in the ground, then they won't be able to find your peas as easily. Spraying doesn't kill the larvae that do the damage because they're protected inside the pods. You'll never reach them. One thing you can do is to pick over the dried peas or seeds being saved before you store them so that you don't store any infested ones. The other big deal for us is powdery mildew, and it happens at the end of every season. So it might be best just to pull up the vines and compost them. At that point, they're done, they're not giving you much, so call it a day. Snap peas may continue to crop, so it's worthwhile planting resistant varieties of those, or using a milk or baking soda spray to head it off at the pass. What you need to do if you're going to use one of those sprays to prevent powdery mildew is to spray every week and alternate the remedies so that you prevent a build-up of resistance. So for the milk one, it's a 10% milk solution, so that's 1 part of milk with 9 parts of water. Just mix it all up and spray it on. The baking soda solution, use 1 gallon of water plus 1 tablespoon of baking soda and 2 tablespoons of horticultural oil. That helps the spray to stick to the plants. Now, if you can't find horticultural oil, you can use light vegetable oil, but test a small area of the plant first. Do mix up your solution, do a little spray, wait 24 hours or so and see what happens. A garlic extract can be helpful. 2 bulbs, not cloves, but entire bulbs of fresh garlic in a quart of water with a few drops of liquid soap. And the liquid needs to be strained through cheesecloth to remove the solids, and then you should refrigerate it. And that's a concentrate, so it needs to be diluted 1 to 10 with water before spraying with it. Compost tea can be helpful, and even oil alone, like vegetable seed oils like canola oil. Use those at a rate of 2.5 to 3 tablespoons per gallon of water, with a 1/4 teaspoonful of liquid soap or dishwashing liquid or so on, to help get the oil into suspension and spray it out onto the plants. And with all those, you should test first. So mix your spray up, spray a small area, wait 24 hours, and see what it does to the plant. The other big disease that I have actually never seen here, but it's apparently around, is pea Anation mosaic virus. And that's spread by aphids in warmer weather. So the ideal way to get around that is just to plant Anation resistant varieties after April the 15th. Before that, they won't get to the hot weather and the aphids anyway, so you don't need to worry. But like I say, I've never seen that in my garden. Now, peas are not the only cold hardy legumes out there. The other common one is broad beans, and those are of course entirely different species to peas, but all in the same legume family. You can plant broad beans in fall to overwinter, or in the spring at the same time as the peas. In my garden, the deer don't bother broad beans, but maybe I haven't had any very hungry deer by when I've had broad beans out the front where they can get at them, so I wouldn't rely on that. Overwintered beans are going to be ready earlier than spring sown, but both of them will take into June or July to make dry beans. The small-seeded types are used for cover crops and for animal feed. The beans are rather tough for human food on those, but you can get quite a lot of different large-seeded, very well-developed broad beans, lots of different varieties. A lot come from the UK, but we do have some in North America as well. And some people like to, when they harvest them and eat them, they like to actually peel the skins off the individual beans, which is rather time-consuming and too much work for my mind. And the other hardy legumes that we have around here are chickpeas and lentils. They grow quite similarly to each other. They're usually a shortish bush. You plant them early with the peas. Even though we think of chickpeas and lentils as coming from hot countries, they actually prefer cool weather. They have 1 or 2 seeds per pod, which makes harvesting of any quantity kind of time consuming. They dry down in about July to August here, and what you want to do is reduce the watering when they're drying down so that they get a chance to actually dry off. The thing is, for me, they both yield much less than soup peas in the same area, so I'm going to grow the peas instead. Now, one of the big things about legumes is that they fix nitrogen in the soil. And people have this idea that if you grow peas or beans or whatever and they fix nitrogen in your soil, and then the next crop you grow will get some of that nitrogen. The thing is, it doesn't work that way. The peas and the beans, all the legumes that fix nitrogen, they're doing it and then using the nitrogen themselves to build their own bodies, and especially to build their own seeds. So if you actually want to get the benefit of some of the nitrogen fixation, then you can grow them onto flowering stage and then cut them down. You can turn them into the soil if you want, or you can just let them rot, but that will give you the most nitrogen fixation benefit for your next set of plants. Once they start developing seeds, you know, peas and beans in their pods, then the nitrogen is going to go into those. That's what makes the protein in those seeds. But the way that works, though, the nitrogen fixation, is legumes develop special relationships with the bacteria that live on their roots and fix nitrogen from the air. And they trade that to the plants in return for sugars that they get from the plant roots. Now, if you're in a new garden or a new location for legumes, you may benefit, or the plants may benefit, from adding an inoculant which contains the right bacteria. And you can buy that at garden stores where you buy seeds. Comes in a little packet, it's a black powder, and you want to just get some of it onto the seeds or into the soil around the seeds when you plant. It doesn't take a lot. But for a lot of people, those bacteria are already in the soil. If you've grown peas or beans or any other kinds of legumes, some of the kinds of bacteria will be there. Quite often they're just floating around or hanging around in the soil waiting. I've planted peas particularly because I plant a lot of peas. I planted them in places where no peas have been grown for at least 15 years because that's how long I've been in this garden. And you pull them up partway through, have a look, guess what? There's those nitrogen nodules. So speaking of nitrogen nodules, this is what they look like. See here, that little bumpy thing? And there's another one on the other side here, little bump. It's about an 1/8 of an inch across. Those are the nitrogen fixing nodules. Inside those nodules, those bacteria are fixing away like little workers. This is a broad bean plant that was planted actually last summer as a cover crop. I never got them pulled out, and they're now all resprouting from their overwintered roots. And that's in a place where there's never been legumes of any kind. So it obviously found the right bacteria. So inoculant certainly won't do any harm. It will add the right bacteria, and you know, but once you've added it once, you don't really need to do it every year. And if you want to actually bring up a plant and look for those nodules, they're kind of pinkish, don't pull up the plant, because what that will do is strip the nodules off the roots as they come out of the soil. You need to dig it up and carefully wash and brush the dirt off the roots so that you can see the nodules. So the use of nitrogen fixation for us from legumes is, number one, we don't have to feed nitrogen to legumes at all. They will make their own from the bacteria. And in fact, if you give them nitrogen, they won't make their own. So, you know, it's a real waste from everybody's point of view. May as well not bother. If we want to use them as a cover crop to feed nitrogen to the next crop, then don't forget to cut them down, turn them over, turn them in, allow them to be pulled in by the soil life about at flowering time. Don't let them start making seeds. So that's hardy legumes. We'll talk about beans and other non-hardy legumes in another video.